Hello, my name is Norman Valdez, and I welcome you to another episode of the Brain Trainer AI for Social Impact podcast. In this episode, we are joined by Jerrold McGrath, an artist, a cultural theorist, and a writer whose work delves into the complexities of rising authoritarianism, climate change, and rapid technological shifts. Jerrold's projects have been featured globally from the UN's AI for Good to Berlin's Spy on Me festival. In this episode, we dive into Jerrold's unique approach to exploring the intersections of ideology, culture, and technology. We discuss how his work engages with AI's potential to reshape our society. Jerrold shares how art can challenge existing narratives and how new paths for social impact, offering a fresh perspective on how AI and cultural movements can drive meaningful change. Tune in to hear how we can navigate the rapidly evolving world of AI and technology, discover how human-centered cultural movements and technological shifts can drive meaningful social impact. Okay, welcome everybody, and we are honored to have Jerrold McGrath with us today. Alex, just kick us off.
We're a big fan of starting off by understanding people's journey and how they end up having a focus on AI for social impact in various ways. So you've had experience as a program director at Banff Center for Arts, and we're largely focused on arts and so forth. Would love to hear how your journey landed up where you are now, and also how that shaped your approach to AI for social impact.
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, I've been working in arts and culture for around 15 years. I was a former program director at the Banff Center and then at Artscape, Daniel's Launchpad here in Toronto. I would say that I came to AI actually in 2017. I was involved in a project where we hosted consultations with the cultural sector in every province and territory across Canada. And when I was originally brought into it, I wasn't, I mean, I knew about AI, but I wasn't particularly engaged with the topic. But in the process of facilitating and hosting these sessions, I became more and more interested in the cultural implications of ubiquitous, cognitive technologies in society. And so my interest has only grown since then, and it's become a central aspect of my practice. And I'll say, like, my work at Banff and Artscape was often about bringing together different disciplines, different ways of knowing the world in order to look at problems in new ways. And so I've been involved in sort of social impact for longer, in fact, than I've been involved in the cultural sector. But I discovered that culture is a great ground from which these conversations can extend, and often an ignored one. And so I'm very interested in the cultural sector's role in framing and outlining the challenges that we need to address before we start thinking about solutions. And so that's the marriage that I'm most interested in.
I know that you've written on LinkedIn. I think you've written in elsewhere specifically around AI, and that's one of the first things that I noticed about that you do that, and I engage in writing as well, and I found many things interesting. But in one of your articles, you made a connection between how we're looking at climate change effects and lack of diverse perspectives. And then you've spoken about how, when it comes to environmental nonprofits and, the mix of racialized communities dealing with the impacts of the climate change and whatnot. Can you just talk a little bit about, that aspect of inclusion, exclusion around just AI, and if you want to make any parallels with climate change, that's also great.
Yeah, can do. So yeah, I can give an example during COVID of how these sorts of elements come together. In March of 2020, a group of us, about 80, got together to start something called the MyTree platform, which was an effort to address gaps in equity in response to COVID. And as a part of this body, we managed to turn a textile factory in India over to PPE production. We repurposed last generation sleep apnea machines for intubation in low electricity or erratic electricity settings. And we did a lot of fundraising for Indigenous women-led projects in the American Southwest that were responding to COVID. And so this was a wonderful opportunity to work with other people from around the world who were often under-resourced but had access to relationships, connections and knowledge that were extraordinarily useful in addressing issues as they popped up in different places. And AI became a sort of a part of that conversation as a lot of folks were seeing the potential benefits that these tools could have, but often didn't feel like they had access to be able to use them, or they lacked the sort of technical knowledge to be able to implement them in their day-to-day operations. And so inclusivity or sort of working around issues related to equity deserving communities in AI is a central part of the work. And mainly that's because most AI is developed with the moral positions of capitalism at the center. It's very much interested in making things bigger or faster. And I think those are noble pursuits, maybe not in and of themselves, but they're useful things to have. But when we're no longer certain that the future will be better than the present or the past, and the sort of the story of modernity for a very long time has been the future is going to be better, we better get there as quickly as we can. But if that logic no longer holds, then to what work are we putting these tools? And I think what we're seeing is that folks who have a vested interest in control or in profit and scale are driving the development of artificial intelligence. And if we don't bring in other ways of knowing the world, other ontologies or epistemologies into the design and dissemination of AI, we're going to be in a lot of trouble because we're going to be building sort of the same thing but bigger and faster. And so I'm extremely interested in both turning these tools over to uses for which their creators had not initially intended, and also looking for applications in places where other values are being centered in what's being done and how people are responding to large-scale change. And climate obviously is one of the biggest sources of volatility now and going forward. And so there is a real need to have multiple parties with multiple perspectives accessing similar tools to develop solutions that we might choose from.
Yeah, quick follow up. Everything that you said, I was like nodding. Is like perfect. Yeah, it's exactly the kinds of things that we talk about, and it's why we work to do inflect systems change, because the current way in which the developments of AI are going, we have this chat with Alex on an ongoing basis about how there's a greater importance placed on profit and then just creating these nice and shiny products. And one very good example of that is recently Sam Altman has been doing a round of interviews and presentations. And I think it's one of them is specifically where he said this. He was very, or what it was revealed, that when it came to ChatGPT 4.0, that there was about 9 days, I think, safety preparation for the model. And it's just because, we're in an AI race, and there are multiple companies who are, caring to top each other off. Google wants to top OpenAI, etc. And a lot of the times, I think the emphasis is on, releasing all of these features, releasing new models, and really not having the real broader perspective, the groups that will get left up. And I think we need those perspectives, and we need people to understand that, there's stuff, there are issues, there are areas that are being left out. And I know the work that we're trying to do at CFC with the Emerging Technology Fellowship is all around, having more voices included as part of this major transformational development. So, yeah, I don't know if you had anything to say of that, but otherwise I hand it off to Alex to.
I mean, just a quick response. I think, yes, I absolutely agree. And I think one of the challenges we face is that I like this idea of having a broad or sort of global perspective on things, but I also don't know that it's always necessary. I think that very local solutions or very local experiments can be effective if there's the possibility that solutions can be taken up by other people. And so I'm very sympathetic to anarchist sort of philosophy and practice in our work. And the concern there, or at least the argument that we bring to it, is that the issue is less about the issue is less about sort of how broadly the major players are looking at the field in terms of assessing what should happen next, and and more that we centralize power in institutions that prioritize certain values over others. And that squeezes out other ways of knowing the world, or other ways of exploring change. And so I don't know. I like the point. Like, I would love if everybody had sort of a wiser, broader view of things, but I don't know how realistic that is. But I would love to see a more level playing field in terms of how solutions are considered and how they're selected. Because right now we're sort of trapped in a small number of narratives or stories about what's possible or what's good. And we really need to expand the stories available to us. And that to me is what artists can do, is they can actually share these configurations that people might say, oh, you know what, that's actually attractive to me and something I hadn't thought of before.
Just to continue in that, and I really like how you said the localization of context really should be looked at, and it can be looked at in various ways. You wrote an article around the problem with AI ethics, where you really critique the Western AI ethic frameworks and really often impose universal principles and ignoring cultural and local context and so forth. How can we build more culturally contextual AI ethics that really start respecting diverse experiences? And I'll just relate it back to what you said. Like, I'm a judge on the Connecting Unconnected Challenge, where there's a focus now on one of the solutions providing localized context and data sets from regions in Africa for LLM training. How can we start doing this more when obviously the power in foundational LLM models now are so centralized? Do we have governing bodies like the UN that is focused more on transferring developed technology instead of providing inclusion into how we're developing technology? How do we start bridging these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a that's a tricky one. My guess is that part of the problem is ontological. Like, we're designing systems, and AI systems by their nature are monoepistemic. Like, everything has to be made legible. Everything has to be zeros or ones at some point. And so we work within dominant frameworks to assess the categories of experience that are meaningful. And so we talk about like LLMs, for example, and I've done quite a bit of work with Blackfoot communities out in Alberta. And language there is the way it was described to me was like it's like running alongside life and describing it as you go. It's a very verb-heavy language. It's not a noun-heavy language. And so the way that LLMs are habitually constructed, looking for patterns and predicting the next sort of word, is less likely to be effective in a context in which language is very much derived from direct experience with the world around us. And so we're applying these tools to systems where language is understood quite differently. And I would actually argue that almost in every culture, language is deployed to different ends. But we're applying one solution across the board. And so I think what we need is we need AI models that are able to integrate different ontological groundings or frameworks in sorting out and categorizing experience. And I think that the process of categorizing is probably also likely to cause harm. But if we're always categorizing in the same way, we're definitely going to be excising or eliding aspects of experience that aren't visible to Western ethical frameworks or even Western ontologies.
I want to touch on the specificity of what one of the things that you do, UKI projects, and that's the intensive programs, and then the ones that are focused on AI and the arts and applying AI for communities. So there's been, I think there's an element of, I think, rejection that comes from artists that feel that their work is being used up in ways that they maybe didn't intend it, or they wouldn't want it, because generative AI is, taking that basis of work. And there's a number, as you very well know, I'm sure, there's a number of lawsuits going on around to Midjourney, to, I think, Stability AI. And then on the other hand, there's, I think, a movement of people who actually see there's opportunity in actually embracing AI and actually incorporating, I would say, as a layer on top of and even amplifying perhaps the ability that you will have to produce artwork and art in general. So to give you an example, I'm sure you follow this, but James Cameron, for example, just joined the board of Stability AI very recently. Whereas there's, a group of maybe in Hollywood who are like maybe very concerned about, especially the special effects artists who may feel threatened by AI taking over their jobs and such. Any perspective on those approaches, ways of thinking?
Oof, yeah, that's a big one. I mean, most of the artists we talk to are not that concerned about models being trained on their work. They don't currently profit from their work, and so not profiting when AI incorporates it is probably not as pressing a concern. I found that most of the sort of concerns about intellectual property and the protection of artists comes from academia, interestingly, and I think there's some self-interest there in terms of protecting a sort of a traditional territory around knowledge and how it's created and transferred. I think the kind of art that we're going to see is going to be very different not just because of AI. I think climate change as well. Like the way that we produce culture, like putting art on the wall. I mean, landscape painting came out of a tradition of wanting to show people your stuff, right? Like, this is my property, it's on my wall. Same applied to family portraits, right? These are my children and my partner, and they belong to me. And so art has always been a reflection of the economic and social systems. And we're going through a change right now. And I think we will have folks that are trying to hold on to economic models that clearly are not working and are not in right relation with the changes underway. So I'll say maybe I'm not as sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to the loss of work. I'm sympathetic to profits being redirected to large sort of platforms and gatekeepers. Like, I think there are serious questions around equity, but I don't have any sort of instinct to preserve the way that art is or has been traditionally made and shared. And I'm excited in many ways to see what people will do with it, because AI opens up, especially like agent-based stuff, it opens up just massive opportunities for creation and expression. But we have to make sure that the people benefiting, that existing patterns of power aren't the means by which gains are allocated, because that's kind of the mess we're in right now. And so we need to rethink something very structural about and how it's valued and how it's consumed.
And from your perspective, because you're in the space and you talk to artists, etc., and you're participating in New Blanche tomorrow, and I think you have some exhibit. It's an output that gets generated by Midjourney, for example, consider art. Like if I just go and generate something that looks actually, I'm sure you've seen many of them, quite impressive outputs that I can create, even simulate like a painting. From what you hear on the space, would they consider that to be art, or what is that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, for me at least, art does a number of things. One, it requires so every time an audience member or a reader encounters a work of art, they do the work of consummating it, like making sense of it. So if I read Cervantes today, like Don Quixote or something, I'm reading it in a different body, in a different place than folks would have read it at the end of the 17th century when it was first written down. And yet it still has value, right? Like, it still tells me something about the world. It still reveals potentials that were otherwise unavailable. And so if an output from Midjourney does that, like if it creates openings for audiences to consummate it, then sure. I think the challenge often is that an artwork is sort of a terrain of uncertain governance. Like, there's the author or the creator, and they have their intentions, and then there's me coming into it, and I bring my own sort of lived experiences, and we try to manage something where we each bring a different excess of seeing, or however we want to talk about it. With a AI generated work, there isn't really a place that it's looking out from. And so maybe it's just me, but I find 99.9% of AI generated work to be really quite boring. It's quite tedious. But that doesn't mean it's not going to get better. When film was first introduced, the first things they filmed were radio shows being produced. And so you had people in the studio with their mics because they didn't know what else to do, right? Like, the genres or the modes of storytelling hadn't yet been mapped out. And I think that's what we're going to figure out. It's like AI is going to allow us to tell different stories in different ways. And we just haven't figured that out yet. I think there's some people doing interesting work. Like Pierre Huyghe in France is doing some really interesting work. And there is good work out there. It's just, we're figuring it out. And just like anything, 90% of it is really, really well-intentioned efforts that will likely be forgotten. And then the stuff that really elevates, the stuff that really moves people will shape what comes next. Because people are going to go, ooh, I really like what Pierre Huyghe is doing, and so I'm gonna do something in that mode, and then that's the direction that the culture goes in. And the worry is that the tools can shape what gets made. And so this is why I believe we need to get sort of artists involved in tool making as well. Because otherwise we sort of become limited in the types of things we can do because the tools are designed in a particular way or for a particular end.
I want to extrapolate a little bit on that, because arts often is allowing us to imagine or collectively imagine and so forth. And right now, for instance, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, but it's something that we're looking at as well through our conversations. Jeff Mulligan talked about the imaginary crisis and vis-a-vis climate change and so forth, where we have an inability to look at a beneficial future, and if we can't see the beneficial future, we can't act upon it. And I'm wondering, as we are struggling, and there's lots of studies and research being done into youth mental health around climate, and now moving into AI, anxiety, and mental health. How can we, and we had a conversation at Mozilla Foundation last week around if we're mired in talking about only military application of AI, when we're down there, we can't imagine what positive uses are there. I love the use of imagination that you're bringing in through the work at UKI projects around the arts projects that you bring about. How can we start moving towards collective imagination, individual imagination, even hybrid imagination, where we're looking at that collaboration between AI and human intelligence to really imagine better outcomes? And where do you see the challenges? And since you have an overlap between arts and social impact in AI, how do you see us using that as a tool?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that shapes our work like day to day. I'll say two things. So Albert Camus, after the Second World War, was asking questions about, well, what do we do like in a world without meaning? And we've seen what war can do, and it really supports a nihilist position, which is, I think, how people are responding in many ways to climate change. And his argument was, well, one of his arguments was that, well, we need artists to present different configurations of justice and freedom that we might want to live in. And then once we've seen it, then we can work towards building it. And his argument was, well, if we have nothing but justice, like if we have the pursuit of justice without any consideration for freedom, we get totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And we're seeing that, like we're definitely seeing that in the climate space as well. And if you pursue freedom without any consideration of justice, you get terror. And we also have seen how that plays out, particularly in spaces where justice is harder to enforce. And he said, so rather than having these two things be constantly in conflict, we need artists to say, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And then people can go, ooh, I like that. I can imagine that future. And then I can start building it. I'll say the second thing is that people actually need encounters with these changes, because often all we do is encounter abstracted versions of them. Like people don't encounter AI, right? They encounter people's opinions about AI online, and then they respond to those second order opinions. And all it becomes is sort of ideological talking points. People know the answer to the question before it's asked, right? And often you can guess, oh, this person, how they will when exposed to a particular change, how they'll respond, because it's part of a package of sort of rules or assumptions that their ideology or their institution or their self-interest demands of them. And so in order to get people to work towards different futures, I think they need like embodied encounters. They need to actually be in relation with the changes that are happening. And that was a month-long project we did in Iceland, was just about that. Like, how do we give people encounters with climate change, with AI, that they can do something about? And we find that it's quite powerful because it's very different. We joke that reading about fire is very different than being burned. And so what we try to do is provide moments for people to be burned a little bit, small fires, but something that they'll remember and that sticks with them, rather than something that either generates outrage because it violates their norms about what things should be, or it confirms what they already believe. We need something else, something that's unsettling, something that they're kind of obligated to linger on, and that's what we work towards.
And I loved a lot of what we're seeing with the work that we're doing to raise awareness and move us from a reactionary understanding in the sector is through that use case and stories and touching and getting closer to, so you can see yourself or your use case in that. But I want to also relate it back to some of what you just mentioned, the unsettling part, especially given the fact that you're coming from anarchist ideology and so forth, and approaching this from a different angle than most people. The opportunities to look at power dynamics and systems change as this technology emerges. How is this an opportunity to disrupt in positive ways existing systems, whether we're talking about education or power dynamics within capital systems and so forth, and when we're looking at redistribution of power and so forth? How can we intentionally lean into that unsettling?
Yeah. I mean, gosh, there's probably, hopefully there's, as many answers as there are people trying to figure out the question. I think that we need to elevate and celebrate other ways of knowing the world as and putting those tools in the hands of those people to see what comes of it. And I think there's been a lot of good work happening around AI and indigenous sovereignty in different contexts, which I appreciate. I think we need to really expand the imaginary. Like we need to be okay with things that feel a little unsettling. Like unfortunately, we design the world to treat us often as if we're children. If anything is unsettling, it becomes selected against, and algorithms can only accelerate that because they really just want us to be happy. And sometimes things that we don't like broccoli or cauliflower the first time out, is something that we come to love over time. And so we need to have some patience in terms of the types of ideas and the types of experiences that we're exposed to. I do think part of it is communication, like the work you're doing, I think is so important because it shares other potential stories that aren't just, we need to be deadly afraid, or we need to jump on this bandwagon as soon as possible. Like we need that healthy culture of criticism as well. And I think we need to be honest about where our self-interests are tangled up in the positions we take in this work, because there's a lot to be lost for people, and I appreciate that. But to conflate sort of moral positions with positions of self-interest can sometimes obscure the issues, particularly when people are in positions of authority and people are looking to them to help set the debate. I become very disappointed when institutional positions are sort of taken on as moral positions, because there are a number of interests at play there, and we don't always have the ability to disentangle what they are.
You mentioned the project you did in Iceland. Was it the means are our ends? Is that the one?
No, it was a shipwreck actually, but
okay. Yeah, I was just curious if you wanted to just break it down or share, because we're talking about like examples and things, projects that you worked on. If you want to just share maybe that or another one that comes to mind.
Yeah, happy to talk about shipwreck. So what we did was we had access to a dairy farm, a former dairy farm that's now an exhibition space in Reykjavik. And we invited 6 Canadian artists to bring ruins of potential futures. And so what that meant was they were supposed to imagine that you're excavating some future society that has collapsed, and you're presenting an artifact from it. We then placed those objects around this giant dairy farm, and then we invited 6 Icelandic artists to come in and to make a home. And one of the reasons for this is, like, when we landed in Reykjavik, we look out the window, there's a volcano erupting. Like, we can see the volcanic eruption from the airplane. It's between our like where we were working and the airport. It was wild. And so we asked people, like, how do you live alongside these things? Like, how do you live with a volcano in your neighborhood, basically? And most of them just laughed because over 1,000 years, they had developed patterns and ways of living alongside these changes. We don't have 1,000 years to live alongside climate change or AI. We got to figure this out quick. And so the invitation to the Icelandic artists was, well, make a home amongst these ruins without damaging the ruins, without moving them. Many of them were very active and very noisy. And they had a week to do that. And then we invited the public in for a 2-week exhibition, and they were tasked with the same thing. Make yourself at home. Make of this space a home. Respond to it. And so this sort of dialogic, this process of engagement with reality or forms of reality was an effort to have different conversations. And so I'll say my submission was a robot vacuum, extremely cute, very, very adorable. And it would cruise around the space cleaning up. And if it heard people talking, it had an AI running it in terms of its a language model behind it. If it heard people talking, it would respond. But it was from a future in which ecological preservation had taken on a very authoritarian or almost fascist bent. And so it was extraordinarily ideological in terms of the need for cleanliness. And so people were like, I want to take a selfie with it. It's so cute. It's so adorable. And then it would say the most awful and, slightly terrifying things. And the effort was there to sort of reflect on the fact that like positions like that would support a kind of eco-fascism, if you want to call that. In the abstract, they're quite attractive. Like, yes, we need to control human excess. We need to save the planet. We need to slow climate change, and what means are available to us, we need to take a hold of. But the reality of it is quite different. The experience of it in a body, in a place, can be really quite unsettling. And so that was my sort of effort or contribution. Others brought different sort of contributions to it. But in the end, it was lived encounters with changes that are underway. And there's a Ursula K. Le Guin quote, the science fiction writer. She says, children know that unicorns aren't real, but they also know that a well-written story about unicorns can be true. And that was really what we were trying to do. We were taking these things, these future states that aren't real yet, and share them in narratives in which they feel true. And then people respond to them as if they are true. And then the response that they have, they become accountable for, they become responsible for, because it's a feeling like once you felt it, you can't forget that you felt it. Like once you know something or once you feel something, it's present with you. And that was the hope of the exhibition. And we had a great turnout. We had the national radio came out. We were covered in the press. We had numbers. And it was really, really lovely to see how people responded. Because it was very unsettling. It was a cacophony. There was noise and robots yelling at you and all kinds of things. But people did find a way to settle in. And that was a joy. It was a lot of fun to be there.
We love when we can bring science fiction and stories into the conversation, and especially when they're as relevant to meaningful conversation as that. I want to just briefly draw on you're a systems thinker. You even though you work in several different areas, you think at different levels. As we're moving towards AI being able to would be used in thematic areas. For instance, in healthcare, it's being used to move cardiovascular health from being reactive to preventative to predictive. Often now being looked at, we can catch an event up to a year before. We're similarly looking at AI playing a role in social system mapping and giving us ability to listen to systems in various ways. And similar, we can start thinking about, can we move our thinking and understanding about systems and how to introduce intervention points and so forth to be not necessarily predictive, but at least move it into an area where we can listen to it more effectively. This is not really a technology issue to get us there. It's more of a culture and mindset issue. We're sitting on a lot of underutilized data where we don't understand AI and so forth. As a system thinker, if you can imagine a future similar to what the imagination that you've done in the projects in the past, how would you move us towards that level of understanding and listening to systems and dealing with the culture and mindset issues that we're facing now?
Yeah, I actually I don't know that I would consider myself a systems thinker. Only, I mean, I guess in many ways, yes, but in other ways, maybe less so. I find sometimes that systems thinking can be, it can be a little bit mechanistic, like it can be a little bit technocratic, and I prefer to err on the side of the local. So I think of it more as dialogic. It might just be like a semantic thing. I don't know that it actually matters. But for me, it's about power, and it's about ensuring that more decisions can be made locally, in order to sort of help people realize their conception of a beautiful life, in ways that make sense for them. I worry a little bit about, in the cultural space too, the centralizing instinct, like this desire for things to be structured in a particular way in order to mitigate or offset some of the potential harm or risk. I get it. Like I have a child, and I try to make her safe however I can. But of course, there's a limit to that. And at a certain point, when I try to make her safe to an extreme degree, the opposite happens because she responds. And so I trying to create conditions within which she can discover her own ways of finding safety and her own ways of defining safety. And for me, that's what I would love to see, is that each of us has the capacity and the permission, to describe what a beautiful life looks like for ourselves, and then we have the tools to attempt to achieve it. I think when we have centralized institutions that have been given the work of taking care of us, we lose that ability to sort of be in relation with other people. And I think we need to recover this. Like, I'm not a Christian necessarily, but this Christian idea of grace, that we get to choose who we love and who we turn towards and who we care for. And this kind of conviviality, or this sort of relationality, I think is what's going to be really necessary, and something that AI can actually help. Like, it actually allows for connection and relationality and process, in really interesting ways, but it doesn't seem to be used that way. I think it's being used more and more to make things legible and to make things predictable, so that we can be less afraid, of an uncertain future. But that uncertain future is coming no matter what. So I think we need to be working locally so that people can be resilient in ways that are consistent with their own social, cultural, economic interests and histories.
Yeah, you just said the word future, and that's exactly what I was going to ask you about. Is there anything in specific that you'd like to share that either keeps you up at night about AI, or anything that keeps you up at night because either you're excited or you're worried, or anything around that, like just future of AI that just does either of or both of those things for you?
Yeah, I think the thing that keeps me awake at night, I'm less worried about humans being controlled by machines. Like, I don't worry so much about that. I do worry that we will give up aspects of being human in order to accommodate the need for efficiency that these systems have. And a simple example is like these automatic checkouts, right? Like, I understand why they exist. Like, they're there for efficiency, so they don't have to have staff. Like, it does all kinds of things, but it removes like a point of human connection in a world where points of human connection are becoming harder and harder to find. And so I think that's what scares me, is that, like, when I was a kid, I used to love peaches, like not the band, but the fruit. And if you taste a peach today, it tastes nothing like peaches did 30 years ago. And there was a fungal invasion that caused the peaches to rot. And so they introduced a variant of the peach that was resistant, but it also tastes like cardboard. And my daughter will never taste the peaches that I did, and they won't be available because they want to continue to do this massive farming and this sort of agro businesses. And it just limits what we have available to us in terms of cultural experiences, in terms of taste. And that's what I worry about. Well, I look on Netflix, and 95% of the shows feel like cheap knockoffs of other shows that they know are successful. And so what stories are not going to be told, because they're dangerous, or because they're uncertain, or because they're unsettling? And if they are being made, maybe they're not being shared because the platforms are not set up to share or distribute those kinds of stories. And so that's I think what keeps me awake at night, is that the sort of the recipes that are available to us to deal with problems will become narrower and narrower, and then we will become collectively more fragile, and we won't know what to do when things go horribly wrong. Or I would argue maybe they are kind of going horribly wrong already, but when it comes to me, or when it comes to the people I love, that we won't know what to do, because we've forgotten.
That's the first thing that comes to mind is how and I'm gonna date myself by saying this, but there was a time where we value a lot the correspondence by written letters, and I did a little bit of that, and there was something valuable about just handwriting and expressing, and it's like your hand made those letters, and then even like calligraphy is a mode of expression all that in itself. It's just how much effort do you put it to be legible, to have a style and all of that, and just like how you can communicate emotions that way. And now of course, who does that anymore? I always like seek for opportunities, like when somebody's birthday or whatever, like if there's a note, I was like, okay, this is my chance. I can do this. I miss this so much. And now everything is so electronic. And now we're talking about how AI is incorporated and embedded in like Microsoft Copilot, OpenAI, and people with one click of a button, they can just like quote unquote improve the email, right? But we write a lot of emails, right? All the time. And people write articles, and like I write, and I often wrestle, and I use AI to improve, and give me feedback about my writing. But I always put the effort to make sure that, like, wait, this is good suggestion, but it's not the way I would say it. It just doesn't sound like me. So often I have to like rewrite, the recommendation that AI gave me, because it's just not me. It's just, I'm not identifying with this. So I just wonder how many people will actually just succumb to, oh, AI does it better than me, so let's like everything is just AI. So AI just speaks on my behalf, kind of thing. So it's what your reflection made me think about.
Well, and I want to say, like, I have a 15-year-old, and I asked her about one of her friends at school, and she's like, "Oh, he's got great handwriting." And so this is the joy of rebellion, is that all these worries that they will rebel by becoming excellent handwriters and valuing the written word. And this is that, like, the human temperament to not want to do what people in authority tell them to do is probably going to save us, because any messes we make, there'll be a generation there to contest them, which we see every day, which is glorious. Like, I think it's glorious. But yeah, I think you're right, though, that once they become in the workforce and once they're like in the world, then handwriting will become a luxury that very few can afford. But in the meanwhile, at least, I'll say that, like, during COVID, when they weren't allowed to often meet, they were writing handwritten notes in the washroom and putting them around the mirrors and whatnot, so that people could know they were cared and loved. And yeah, I stay awake at night mainly because I worry about adults, but I do have some confidence that young people will do their best, even though they're probably the first generation that's not dealing with the assumption that the future will be better than the present. Like, it's sort of the first generation that has to acknowledge that maybe things won't be better. And yet they still manage to make and do beautiful things. So
yeah, no, as we often say, we will go probably more and more with talking with you, and we'd love to have you again. But I think right around this time we have to just reach the end. I want to thank you for joining us, but I also just want to give you the opportunity to share anything, whether it's UKI projects or anything that you're working on that you would like to share with the audience.
Sure, yeah. I'm not sure when this will go live, but we are hosting our Carnival of Shipwreck from October 23rd to 26th at Spadina in Adelaide, in Toronto. UKAI Projects, UKAI projects.com if you want to learn more. Shipwreck is based on the work of José y Ortega Gisset, who was a Spanish philosopher who argued that culture is the swimming stroke once we find ourselves alive and in the water, and that over time we lose our ability to swim because we become burdened by sort of all these systems and structures that we build for ourselves. But we need to learn how to swim again, and we need to learn how to be in the water. And so our festival is a bit of a celebration of that. And lots of artists, from over 70 artists, will be presented. A very long day, so I'll be quite exhausted. But also local provocations, lectures, workshops, the whole deal. It'll be a lot of fun.
I saw the invite on LinkedIn, so I will be there, and we will put the link on the recording. We should be able to go next week, so I think it will give time people to to be exposed to that before the event. But yeah, once again, thank you so much. Thank you, Alex, and thank you everybody that listened to the podcast. Please like, share, and repost, etc. And yeah, I look forward to having you with another guest on the next episode. Thank you.